Being nice is a scapegoat excuse for a very mediocre and unremarkable life. I mean, if you look up the etymology of the word nice, it comes from the Latin word nescius, meaning ignorant, from the verb nescere, to not know. Old English used the word to describe somebody very subtle and coy and reserved. And today, a nice person is somebody who's very agreeable and pleasant and satisfactory. And look, as a female, I was already born into the very conscientious, nice archetype. And as a child and subsequent adolescent, I seemed to grow very fond of these traits. I was good-natured, I was very understanding and naive. I wanted to be sweet and kind, and I never wanted to upset anyone. And you know where that left me? Unable to voice my opinions and stand up for myself, being practically a doormat and letting people take advantage of me in subtle ways, unsure of who I really was, wanting people to like me, and so I would dilute myself down into this distilled version so that everybody who met me thought that I was cool. Being taken advantage of, fearful of confrontation, never leaving a lasting impression on people, never demanding respect and attention. Being nice sucks, and the world is not kind and forgiving to nice people. Nice people do not leave their impression and mark on the world. And then one day, I read The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. And at first, I thought this shit is manipulative AF. I mean, it's just a way to lie and cheat and scheme your way to the top, to do people dirty, basically an amoral handbook. Laws like conceal your intentions, pose as a friend, work as a spy, stir up waters to catch fish, crush your enemy totally. I thought this Machiavellian school of thought was inauthentic at best and destructive in most cases. Until I got about halfway through and I really started to draw parallels between these events that were taking place in history to gain the upper hand and to shift power dynamics, and relating it to situations that had happened in my life and realizing, holy shit, I was duped, I was played. How did I not realize what was going on here? I was analyzing past situations and so-called friendships and dynamics between co-workers, and I realized so many laws of power had been exercised unto me unknowingly and ignorantly because I was being nice. One of the biggest ones that stood out to me was law number 9, to win through actions and never through argument. So I had a very close friend for many years, and it took me a long time to realize that she was quite disingenuous in her ways. Look, from the outside looking in, we never fought. She never really confronted me. We never argued. And yet she embodied this rule through and through. I was so naive throughout the years of our friendship that I didn't realize I was relinquishing control bit by bit. And her actions always gave her the upper hand. She always got her way, even though not a single word was exchanged. There were so many implicit read between the lines situations that took me a while to catch on to, and when I finally had, I didn't know how to navigate my way through these problems. Years later, I remember sitting and thinking, how did we even get here? Like, I was constantly losing, I was low-key scared of her, and I became very uncomfortable every time I was around her when not too long ago, I used to think she was my best friend. I felt like she didn't respect me and value me, and things were always on her time and her terms. And yet, out of fear of disrespecting her or losing our friendship, and for the sake of our history, I put up and shut up, even though it was actually harming me more than it was helping. So being nice is not always the right thing to do. There were so many other nuances in the unspoken, in so many situations that had gone right over my head. Like, there were so many times at work when somebody would say something subtly, and even though it wasn't an outright dig, shade was thrown. I never really knew how to match their energy and defend myself with the same subtleties. I had an old manager who would make a seemingly harmless remark in a group setting and yet managed to inject snake venom into his passive-aggressive joke. And I never knew how to match his energy and dish it right back, again, in a subtle and professional way. It wasn't until I read The 48 Laws of Power that I realized he was actually exercising 2 laws. Law number 1, never outshine the master. Always make those above you feel comfortably superior. I definitely threatened his authority. I definitely stood out in my team, and he always felt the need to put me in his place for the sake of his own ego. And law number 6, court attention at all times. It's not about how well your team members do, no, it's about how well you lead them as a team. And you see, if I had known these laws, I would have conducted myself in a better way to not necessarily make friends with him, but get them wrapped around my finger while still being the best in the team. Suddenly, the book took on a whole new meaning for me. It became my shield rather than my sword. It opened my eyes up to the power plays around me that my former naive self never really took notice of, or never really knew how to use language to describe what was going on. It was always these subtleties, these intuitions, but I could never really actualize it. It's like my operating system upgraded, like I downloaded Norton Security and I had malware software now fighting off these attacks, and for the first time ever, I was finally able to play the game. And look, while one may mourn the loss of innocence after eating from the tree of knowledge, the matter of fact is we don't live in the Garden of Eden anymore. And so you have to equip yourself to be able to handle these situations and be on the defense. You cannot survive if you don't know what you're up against. And I'm not just talking about an enemy. How I conducted myself in business, how I would demand respect within my relationships, how I even showed up online all dramatically changed because my naivete and gullibility were no longer holding me back anymore. And some of the laws were actually very necessary to start adopting so that I could grow, be a better communicator, and become more sagacious. Like law number 2, never put too much trust in friends. Learn how to use enemies. Law number 4, always say less than necessary. I know I ain't the only one that struggles to uphold that law, but we need to keep our mouth shut, okay? People out here throwing the evil eye in every direction. Say less than necessary. Law number 10, avoid the unhappy and the unlucky. Law number 11, learn to keep people dependent on you. And that goes hand in hand with law 13, which is to never appeal to somebody's mercy or gratitude when asking for help, but rather appeal to their self-interest. It isn't necessarily to manipulate, but rather to take advantage of human nature and make yourself indispensable. Make yourself desirable, because that increases your inherent value and you're more likely to succeed. Law number 17, cultivate an air of unpredictability. Okay, make yourself seem sexy and attractive. Law 18, this is a big one. Do not build fortresses to protect yourself. Isolation is dangerous, and this is something that I've struggled with whenever I go grind mode or monk mode. It's isolate yourself, disappear for 6 months. I'm sure you've seen it on like money Twitter. You have to disappear for 6 months in order to do well in life. No, you don't. You actually need to get around circles, the right circles, because your network is your net worth. Law 35, master the art of timing. Law 40, despise the free lunch. Law 38, think as you like, but behave like others. These laws bestowed upon me the wisdom to conduct myself in a better way. These laws completely transformed the way I conducted myself in business. I was a lot more desirable. I didn't come across as needy and salesy. I was more authoritative and interesting, and my offerings were well timed. When I met new people, I was less focused on the getting them to like me part, often by being an open book and blabbering and just oversharing, and instead became the observer and wanting to understand them and taking control of the conversation by asking them questions, essentially taking lead. And naturally, I kind of saw the unfolding of this new power dynamic, and not that it was malicious in its intent. I took it more as an experiment just to see how I could hold myself in this upper position. I became a lot more guarded and enigmatic. I learned to read people better, and all the subtleties in the room stood out so much more to me. It's like I developed a sixth sense. I developed an appreciation for human behavior and its predictability. I started to say what was on my mind a lot more without fearing that I was going to offend somebody or being the outcast, but I was very selective with what I said, the way I said it, and I would always test my audience first before saying it. I felt like I finally found my voice. I found my passions and values. I always used to think that I was such a, friendly girl next door. And when people meet me now, they're like, yeah, she's cut and dry. Like, she says it as it is. She's a bit of a savage. I never thought that that would be me, but come to think of it, that's who I always had been. That's how I always expressed myself with my closest friends and my family and at home and online. It just took such a long time for me to live in alignment in a real world setting. I learned that I like to swim against the grain. I do have very unconventional opinions, and I can come across as a little bit bitchy, but that's just because I'm sarcastic and I say it as it is. The nice little girl that I once was has no place in the person that I am today. There were downsides to this reinvention of self, however. I had a phase for a few months afterwards where, not gonna lie, I was a little bit drunk on power. It's like I finally tapped into something that I'd never had before and I wanted to exercise it at every opportunity. I felt like a savage. I always felt the need to maintain the upper hand, even if that meant being petty or outsmarting somebody who didn't even have any ill intentions to begin with. I always felt like somebody was out to get me, and it almost kind of became a bit of paranoia where I was always on the defense and I would always see the worst in people rather than being the realist that I always was. I would come home after a social interaction and think, oh my God, I gave away too much. I overshared just for having a normal conversation that didn't even get that deep. You know, as simple as, this is what I'm doing this weekend and here's what I think about Drake's new album. It's like I wanted to be a robot, show no personality for the fear of giving away too much and wanting to be guarded and wanting to know more about the other person than they know about me, thinking that that was a power play when really it was just taking away from the quality of my relationships. I had tapped into this power that I never knew I had before, and I actually got really freaking good at using it. However, I noticed myself slowly sliding down this slippery slope towards this Caesar-like folly of being entirely enamored by your own authority, but ultimately one that leads to your own tragic downfall. I noticed myself losing the kindness and the empathy that I once loved about myself, even if it hadn't served me as well as the laws of power had. I was at a crossroads. I knew I definitely didn't want to be nice anymore. I didn't want to be known as the nice girl, but I also didn't want to be known as ruthless and savage. I think what I really wanted was to be magnanimous. The definition of that word is so beautiful. Let me read it out. Having or showing a noble and courageous spirit, being generous and forgiving, especially towards a rival or less powerful person. So I didn't want to be like Jon Snow. Like, that guy got fucked over way too much, okay? I also didn't want to be Miss Daenerys Khaleesi, okay? She was a bit too much. I think I wanted to be like Arya. Like, you know that bitch can fuck you up, but she exercises a lot of control and she has compassion and mercy. I think Ned Stark is another really good example of a magnanimous character. Someone who knows how to play the game, but doesn't forfeit their humanity just to get to the top. Being generous and forgiving, but confident in yourself and knowing that you're not going to let people overstep your own boundaries just because you're kind. I can't believe it took me 24 years to realize that being nice is not being kind and kindness is not niceness. This is why looking up the etymology of words is so important, because it actually gives you insight into the true meaning of the word and the power that holds it, rather than using it the way that this diluted English language does. You know who I think embodies this whole archetype perfectly? Jesus Christ himself. Hear me out, hear me out. This man was never nice. Jesus was not nice. He certainly wasn't agreeable and pleasant and satisfactory. I mean, in his time, he was a viral sensation. He shook nations. He went up against the status quo. He said some pretty badass, radical things that challenged the customs and traditions at the time. He stood his ground against scholars and even Pontius Pilate himself. Ain't no nice person gonna do that. And yet he literally fought temptation from the devil himself. He put demons in their place. And yet he remained meek and gracious and kind. He didn't have a fear of speaking his mind, and he knew how to play the game that I've been talking about this whole time. Like, the perfect example I can think of is when the Pharisees were trying to stone the adulteress, and they tried to trap him by using scripture, Jewish scripture. And he basically played it right back at them to save this woman. He knew who he was dealing with. And I can say that he applied the 48 laws of power pretty damn well, either on the defense or the offense. He was bold and unafraid. And I think that's what we should be, bold and unafraid. Having knowledge of the dark devices that people use to get what they want does not have to tarnish your good nature, but you do still need to be aware of what they are and how to deal with them. And if Jesus wasn't nice, then why should we aim to be nice and teach our children to do so as well? Instead, we should be provocative, bold, outspoken, polarizing, move freaking mountains, but also exercise restraint. Every mighty warrior needs temperance, otherwise they'll just be a slave to their own ego, and that never ends nicely. Fuck being nice, be magnanimous.